Thanks, Jonathan. I saw the notice in the Defender Digest that they were accepting nominations for the Bill O'Connor Award, and right away I thought of Dan Barry. But those of you that know Dan, not a lot of you do, but I sat down and I realized that Dan is the person that would fit the category. Dan is the person that's client-centered. Dan is the person that's a dedicated public defender. Dan is the one that cares. And it just so happens I was kind enough to be mentored by that man. And it meant a lot to me to see to it that people outside of Western New York knew what a great lawyer and defender that Dan Barry was. But what you don't know about Dan is, because I know him, I had to call and get his permission that I could nominate him. Because Dan doesn't want any recognition. Dan only wants to work in the courtroom. He wants to represent his clients, and he doesn't take guff from anybody, and all he wants to do is do God's work as he told. That's all he wants to do. So, to share a story, Charlie O'Brien called me and said that Dan Barry had been selected. And then about 2 hours later, I received a voicemail message. I happened to be in court. It was from Dan. And it went something like this. You son of a bitch. I told you you could nominate me, but you didn't say anything about winning the award. That is Dan Barry. In 1962, Dan started the Legal Aid Bureau of Buffalo. For 8 years, he toiled on the civil side because he didn't get an opportunity to show his true talents in the criminal courtroom representing the indigent. 1970, Dan became a public defender in Buffalo City Court. This is 2008. Dan is still a public defender in Buffalo City Court. He could have retired a long time ago. He doesn't want to because he says there's nothing to retire from. He loves his job every day. Well, most days. Just so you all know, he is not in some cushy chair sitting at a table just previewing cases. Dan represents approximately 1,800 people a year in 3 intakes in Buffalo City Court. He is a man that is dedicated, not only to his work, but to his family, Mary and his daughter Monica and his son Brian. Dan told me a story tonight that I had never heard before. Shortly after he started as a public defender in Buffalo City Court, people recognized what a good trial lawyer he is. So what does that mean? Well, the DA's office called and wanted him to come over and be an assistant district attorney. It was more money. He had his 2 young children at the time, and Dan said no. Again, 38 years later, he's still serving what he wants to do, is serve the people in Buffalo City Court. The best thing that Dan could impart is this. I started in Buffalo City Court in 1983. I was given no training. I was given blank files, a copy of Gilbert's, and pointed to the direction of Part 1 in Buffalo City Court. After a week of not knowing what I was doing or how I was doing it, somebody suggested I seek out Dan Barry. I did. A month later, I tried my first case to a jury. Fortunately, my client was convicted. I sat down with Dan, talked to him about it. He gave me some pointers. 2 weeks later, I went in, tried another case, and my client was acquitted. It wasn't because of me, it was because of that man. What you should know, too, is now in Buffalo City Court, new criminal defense attorneys, new public defenders, new assistant district attorneys, and more importantly, the new judges, both appointed and elected to Buffalo City Court, seek out Dan. They want him in his part. They want to be on the opposite side of him. Because this is why. Dan taught all of us a long time ago that there is nothing wrong, and in fact what you should be doing is putting the state to its proof every single day. Dan was the one that said, don't be afraid to ask for a trial. Don't be afraid to be in there and try the case, because that's what you do as a public defender. 38 years later, he's still doing it. One last thing. We used to talk about Dan's wisdom as Barryisms, off his last name, obviously. I was there, and about 2 years later, I went to work for Ed Nowak in Monroe County. I was getting ready for a trial. It was my first felony trial, and I was nervous, and I talked to Dan. Still my mentor, called him. And Dan, as only Dan could say, is, forget about it, kid. What are you worried about? I said, but Dan, it's 12 jurors, not 6. Dan, it's not an assault case. It's a murder case. And he stopped me right there and he said, Mark, you know the difference between an assault case and a murder case? And I said, no. I had no idea. Here's some great wisdom. And he said, there's one less witness at a murder trial. That's who this man is. That's the type of wisdom you get. But more importantly, he is truly client-centered. Congratulations, Dan.